So it's my great pleasure to welcome Sam as the second guest on the Lucid Programming Podcast. He is the founder of Byte-by-Byte, a company dedicated to helping software engineers interview for technical roles. Sam's students have landed jobs at companies including Amazon, Uber, Bloomberg, and many more. Sam is also the author of Dynamic Programming for Interviews, which is a very fantastic ebook to help anyone master the concept of dynamic programming. I found this to be a very helpful book myself. I think it's probably one of the better treatments of this subject. And if you are struggling with the subject, I encourage you to download the book on his website. It's for free. The link will be in the description of this video. A little bit more on Sam. He graduated from Princeton, majored in computer science, and during this time was also involved in some other non-computer science hobbies, such as singing acapella group, which is really interesting. Hope we get to talk about that a little bit later. Music definitely kept me singing when I was doing my computer science song and dance as well. Currently, Sam is working full-time as a software engineer in the New York area and is at time focused working with languages like Java and Go. And in what little free time Sam probably has, he also volunteers as a mentor to high school students to prepare them for technical interviews, which is really fantastic. So in addition to this podcast, you can find out more about Sam and what he's currently doing on his website, and that will be linked in the show notes as well. So Sam, thank you again for taking the time to chat with me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So maybe if you want, just kind of fill in any gaps of the above, just give a little bit of an introduction, tell me about who you are, what you do, fill in any of the missing pieces that I mentioned before, and yeah, just kind of go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So most of that was really spot on. A couple corrections I should make, or I'm actually not working full time anymore. So
congratulations.
So what I do is I run a business called Byte-by-Byte, as you mentioned, that helps software engineers interview for jobs. And the core goal here is, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, you go into an interview at a company like a Google or a Facebook, and you have to do these technical interviews, which are just so different from what we normally have to do in our day-to-day job. And so what I do is I help software engineers to prepare for those interviews by thinking about, like, what are the strategies that we could use here? How can we be both efficient in how we're preparing and then also perform effectively in those interviews? So this is actually my full-time gig now. I have a couple of courses that I have a course on dynamic programming as well that goes along with the ebook, and I also have just been testing a course on recursion, which is going to be coming out in October. So that's sort of me in a nutshell.
That's great. And you mentioned that your primary focus at the time is kind of coaching.
I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear. Oh, sorry. Let me just get the microphone there. Sorry about that. Right. Okay. So you mentioned that a lot of your time right now is focused on coaching people to prepare for interviews. And I know that when you graduated, let me just say this, that a lot of the content focused on my own channel is really kind of geared in that domain as well. So I think a lot of people could find some value in maybe your take on how you would best prepare, let's say for somebody that graduated from a computer science program, what would be the strategy that you would maybe give to them to prepare effectively for a technical interview? I know it's kind of a broad domain. It's a bit of a broad domain. We can kind of narrow that down a little bit more, but maybe we can kind of start there and kind of whittle that down a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the first thing that everyone should think about when they are preparing is, what are your core goals? And I think that this is something that, a lot of us are like, oh, well, my goal is to work at Google. And that's fine, but really taking a moment to dig into the why. Like, what is it that you really want? Is it really to work at Google, or is it to work on cool projects, or is it to have job stability, or is it to have that name on your resume so that you can get jobs in the future? And when I work with people, a lot of the students that I work with are like really focused on those top tier, big four companies. And they have their sights really set on that. And it's not necessarily the most important thing. So I think the first thing to do is to figure out, what are your core goals? So like, what companies will actually help you achieve those goals? There are a lot of companies other than Google that are doing really cool projects. There are a lot of companies other than Facebook that will give you job stability and that will pay really well. So that's really the first step, and that's even before you get into the interview prep. But then once you get to interview prep and actually preparing for your interviews, I think that one of the most important things to think about is what is going to give me the most bang for my buck? How am I going to spend my time as productively as I can so that I can spend as little time as possible getting as many results as possible? And there's this concept called the 80-20 principle, which people may be familiar with. And basically the concept says that if you, that 80% or 20% of the effort that you put in will give you 80% of the results. And that's, how I would think about at a large scale, and we can, definitely go into more of the specifics, but at a large scale, how I would think about preparing for software engineering interviews, because you want to focus on what are going to be those sort of key pieces that are most important, rather than say worrying about like, well, do I remember how to do a star search, or do I remember how to implement a red-black tree? Like, these are just things that aren't likely to come up. And so focus on the things that are going to be most important and that are going to come up the most often, and that will cover 80% of what you need to know, and then you can start getting more specific.
Right. And I think that's really important. That whole 80-20 principle, the Pareto principle, is really, I think, just something that applies to many different domains. I know I've listened to a couple other interviews with you, and I know you're a fan of Tim Ferriss, and he is a big fan of this principle as well, as am I. So if I was to ask what the 80-20 principle would look like, what is the 80%? When you have a student that comes to you, you think that they have a valid reason as to why they should pursue, let's say, a career at Google or Facebook or Microsoft, and you're basically you're like, okay, I'm going to work with this person. What is the 80%? What resources do you point them to? What do you have them focus on that constitutes that 80%?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a couple specific things. So first of all, my resource of choice, other than, of course, the resources that I made myself, which I'm a little biased, is cracking the coding interview. And the thing I love about cracking the coding interview as compared to, I'm sure that any of your audience who's been doing any interview prep has come across cracking the coding interview, elements of programming interviews, LeetCode, HackerRank, all these different options. And the thing that I like about cracking the coding interview is that it represents sort of a narrow slice of all of the information out there. And it shows you specifically, these are the things in each topic area that you need to know. So it almost does a lot of that 80-20 analysis for you and reduces it to what are the important things. And what I actually did, which your audience may find valuable, is I recorded a video on my YouTube channel that goes through like what are the specific things in cracking the coding interview I'd focus on. Because you can actually even get more specific, and I think there are things in cracking the coding interview that are not super relevant. And how do you approach this? What is, I have it sitting next to me right now. It's a really thick book. So how do you approach that effectively? And so that's one of the main things that I would focus on is cracking the coding interview, reading through that book effectively. And then the other thing that people tend to miss actually, which is really, really important, is how do I deal with getting stuck in an interview? Right? Like in my experience, everyone has some basic level of skill. Like let's assume that you have the skills that you need to get the job. A lot of the people are going to have those skills, but what separates the people who succeed from the people who fail? The thing that separates them is that one group of people, when they get stuck on a problem, they don't know what to do. And they just stay there and they sort of just throw stuff at the wall and try and get out of this hole that they're in. The other people know strategies that they can use to keep moving forward even if they're stuck. And so like to give a couple examples of what these strategies might look like, one thing that I was talking with a client today actually is break down, when you see a problem and you don't know what to do, break it down into what are all the pieces of information that I actually have. So like you're going to receive a problem in your interview and your interviewer will give you some specific pieces of information. But that's not necessarily all you know about the problem. So for example, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Sure. But there's a problem where and this might get a little technical, so just bear with me.
No, that's the whole purpose of it. Great.
If you have a binary tree, that binary, or a binary search tree, that tree can be generated from multiple different orderings of the input. So like I can insert items into a binary tree in different orders and end up with the same binary search tree as a result. And if anyone wants to reference this, I believe it's question 4.9 in the most recent coding interview.
Fantastic.
If my memory serves. And so this is the broad question that you're asking is, come up with all of the different orderings of input that would give you that same binary tree. And this sounds like that's not very much information, but we can actually start to break down the problem and think about what other knowledge do we have? How can we extrapolate from what we know to get more information? So for example, one piece of information that we know for a fact is that when we are creating a binary tree, the root of the tree is always the first node that we have to insert into the tree, no matter what, because otherwise it wouldn't be the root node.
Sure.
And so we can start to break down the problem in this way. And this would be like something that you could do if you're really stuck in your interview that would help you to basically get unstuck. That's the goal. And I think that's something that people don't practice enough and don't really think about enough. But if you understand how to get unstuck and how to keep moving forward, even if that's just looking at like a brute force solution to the problem, a brute force solution is better than no solution at all.
Right. Absolutely.
How can you think through the problem and how can you break it down to keep moving forward and move towards that answer? And those are probably the two biggest things that you can focus on when you're preparing for an interview.
And for getting unstuck, how does one approach this in a practice session? So it's one thing to cracking the coding interview, sit down, make a nice cup of tea, kind of go at a leisurely pace and just work through those problems. And that's all well and good. But when you're thrown into a room with some people that are there to assess your performance, it really is kind of a different ballgame. So how would you recommend someone to practice getting unstuck in a situation like that where the pressure is on, there's time pressure, kind of practice like you play, I imagine, is one of the things you'd probably suggest. But is there any other suggestions for getting unstuck in that type of setting?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely practice as you play is like one of the key things, right? It's like both practice these things practice these strategies in your practice session. So like, go through different problems, and as you get stuck, there are a couple of different things that you can try. You can try going through a brute force solution and seeing if that works. Try breaking down the problem into sub-problems. You can try, I'm totally blanking on what the other ones are. I had a blog post that I wrote about 10 of these, and I'm totally forgetting now.
I can also point the listeners.
Let's link people to the blog post so that they can look at that directly, because that will do this more justice than I can in this moment.
Of course.
But one of the things I would do is go through that blog post and go through the items. If you're stuck on a problem, try each one and see, how can I apply this in this case? And then you get used to like what strategies work for you. So not all the strategies are necessarily going to be really effective for you. Some might be easier than others. One that I personally like is going through the problem by hand and basically trying to codify what you're doing manually into an algorithm. And I think that's a really good strategy. But apart from just practicing these things, the other thing to do is really get practice putting yourself in higher pressure situations. So a couple things that you can do here. One is that, you can definitely hire a coach, and that's one option. But other things that you can do, other free options are, there's a site called pramp.com, which has free peer-to-peer mock interviews. There's a site called interviewing.io, which also has, I believe they pair you with engineers at different companies. And so you can do mock interviews with those people. And then practice these techniques in those interviews. So you're getting that experience with the interview process. And then the one other thing that I haven't tested this out, so you're hearing it here first, is something I discussed with a client, is videoing yourself going through a problem. Because there's a lot of pressure when you're on camera, even if no one else is going to watch it. you can videotape yourself doing it, and that just ups the pressure because you want to do a good job. If you really want to take it to the next level, commit to post it on YouTube or something. But at the very least, just videotaping it will increase the pressure a lot, and timing yourself so you can do whatever you can to like emulate that interview experience.
Right. Those are great tips. And I'll be sure to absolutely put in the blog post that you have that has all of the tips as well. And also the video that you mentioned earlier about cracking the coding interview, because I found that to be really helpful as well. I want to go back a little bit to what kind of you were saying before when you kind of structure the why as to why do you want to get a job at Google? Why do you want to get a job at Facebook? And I kind of wonder, you don't have to elaborate too much on specifics, but I kind of wonder, what is the general answer from people? Do they sort of look like a deer in headlights? I mean, have they really thought about this question before? Is this something that just kind of knocks them off kilter? Have they really given this much thought? And if so, do you notice a lot of overlap between their responses? What is the typical response for a question like this?
So, I mean, the short answer is people haven't thought about it, right? It's not something that we honestly do think about that much. I think that a lot of times, there's a lot of pressure on us from a lot of different angles to accomplish a certain thing. It's the same as like, your parents wanting you to become a doctor or a lawyer or something, right? It's like there is this vision there is this external pressure for us to be quote unquote successful. And I think that in a lot of cases, we view these as being the companies that will be like us being successful. And so people don't think about it a lot, but when you do dig under the hood, this is the important thing, is to do this exercise. And the exercise, I think, is probably also something that I learned from Tim Ferriss, but it's your 5 whys. And so the way that this exercise works is that you say what you want. So let's say I want to make $1 million. I'm going to use a non-coding related example. Sure. I want to make $1 million. Well, why do I want to make $1 million? Oh, well, maybe I want to make $1 million because I don't want to have to work every day. And well, why don't I want to have to work every day? And maybe that's because I don't like my job. And then I can say, why don't I like my job? Well, it's because I have to deal with that like really annoying HR person, or I have to do X. And now no longer do we have to make $1 million. The solution is just to fix that one little thing. And so in the same as it comes to interviewing, if, for example, let's say that you want to work at Google. You want to work at Google, why? Because Google is going to give you more job security. And why do you want more job security? Well, because you don't feel like you have strong enough skills to be able to get another job if you lose your job. Or I don't know, there might be a million reasons, but you sort of narrow down to what that core need is. And there will be some core need. Maybe it's something you can directly address, or maybe it's something like I need to feel like I am successful because I have this is something that's important to me. And so then you can think about, rather than I specifically need a job at Google, what are different ways that I could be successful? What are different things that I could do that would make me feel successful? And now you have more options. It's not a matter of saying like you shouldn't want a job at Google. Like the point is not to say no, that's a bad thing, because it's not. Right. It's really to narrow down what is that very specific thing that you want that goes deeper than just I want a job at Google. Like maybe you want to work on artificial intelligence, and you know that Google is doing all these AI projects. And so that becomes, rather than just being, I want a job at Google, you get this whole long list of companies that are doing really exciting things with artificial intelligence. And now you have way more options. So it's really about like breaking that down and figuring out what your options are and what is driving you. And I think, what you'll find in the long term is that you'll be a lot happier if you figure out what's driving you and how to directly address that, rather than just trying to address this sort of tangential goal that you think will get you there.
Right. So you definitely went through the 5 whys in your own journey, because as you corrected me earlier on, you no longer write software for a company. You are running this Byte-by-Byte thing completely as your main ship right now, which is great. I think congratulations, first off.
Thanks.
And I think that's fantastic. What was, if you want to elaborate on it, what was your, I guess, path to doing this? Like, how did you go from, I don't want to work at a job anymore, I want to kind of focus on my business? Like, what was your trajectory there?
So let me first say, for anyone out there who's thinking about starting their own business, that I did not quit my job and start a business. I started a business and then I quit my job, which is a very, very different thing. So just
Absolutely.
like you don't, I just want to point out, you don't have to do, it's not an all or nothing thing. You don't have to do one or the other. What I did was I knew, back in college, there was a lot of like entrepreneurship on campus at Princeton. And so I sort of got enamored by the idea of starting a company of some sort and doing entrepreneurship in some way, shape, or form. And I thought that was going to be starting a VC-backed startup, because that was sort of that's the cool thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then I graduated and I got a job, and I made some minor attempts I had made some minor attempts in school at starting different things, but that never really went anywhere. And so what I realized was I still had this desire to do something like this, but my real why is not that I want to make $1 million or that I want to do any of these other things. It's that I want to have freedom. And so I don't need to have a huge VC-backed startup for that. I don't need to be making millions of dollars a year. I just need to invest intelligently so that my investment can compound and continue to generate me revenue in a way that will support me. And so that's like one side of things. And then the other side of things is that I've sort of known this for a long time, but I really like to teach. Both of my parents are actually college professors, so I think it's probably genetic. But I never really wanted to go into academia because I don't like teaching at such a high level. And so what I realized is that I could actually combine two things that I'm really excited about, which is, teaching and software development and software engineering, into a business teaching something related to software development. And it took me a while to figure out like what is something that I can teach better than other people. So that was sort of a process. But then I started working on this on the side while I was working at my old company, and just experimenting, putting some YouTube videos out there, writing blog posts, and just seeing and doing a little bit of coaching as well, and just seeing what the response was. And over the course of a year and a half, which is the amount of time that I spent working on this while I still had a full-time job, it developed and it started to grow. And then I realized, this is something, I discovered the passion around this business after I had started it. I didn't know for a fact this was going to be the thing, because there are things that I'm passionate about that no one would pay me money for. And so you have to find that intersection of where people are actually willing to pay because you're helping them in a meaningful way, and where and where you can actually help them. And so this was sort of that intersection where it was really the best of both worlds. And it's really just grown from there since I've been doing this full time for a little over a year now. And certainly a business grows a lot more once you leave your full-time job and you can work on the business full time. Yeah. But I do miss coding. And so like, that's definitely a thing that I think about. But at the same time, I love this because building a business to me is kind of similar to programming. Absolutely. In the sense that they're both problem solving. It's a different sort of problem solving, but at the end of the day, it's problem solving. So that's it's problem solving and it's helping people. And those are the two things that, how can you go wrong with that combination?
No, I very much agree. And you make a good point about not jumping ship before you have, kind of established some type of foundation. There's a good book I read recently, which I believe was called The 10% Entrepreneur. And the whole goal of that book is, how do you start something while you're working a full-time job, sort of 10% of your time dedicated to that. And I think most people think it's kind of an all or nothing ordeal where they just sort of go like, okay, if I'm going to start a business, I've got to quit my job and then just kind of go from there, hit the ground running, which is probably not the smartest way to go. So I think that's definitely, you kind of pursued it in the right way. What, if I can ask, when you were working, when did you decide, okay, this is the time for me to transition? And like, how did that actually come about? Like, was it a certain like number of viewers on your YouTube channel, people reading your blog, certain amount of consultants or consultancy that you were doing? What was kind of the breaking point for you?
Yeah, so I probably took I'm not sure that the path I took would be a good path for a lot of people, but
Mm.
for me, I quit when I couldn't handle doing both at once.
Mm.
Once the business had grown to the point and I was getting burnt out enough that it was unsustainable, I think that a good heuristic that a lot of people like to use is once you're making enough money from the business to support yourself, then quitting your full-time job. I was in the lucky position that I had enough savings that I could quit my job before I was actually making up all of that income from the business. So I was making money from the business. It wasn't like I was, it was starting to grow. I was seeing a clear trajectory upwards. And so that was part of it. And then the other thing that I realized is I had money to support myself for probably a year or two. But what I said is that this is not a final decision. I'm not quitting my job forever and burning all my bridges and saying I can never go back to working full time. I'm
Sure.
saying I'm going to take 6 months. I'm going to try this. And then that still gives me a year and a half to find another job if things really aren't going well. And for me, I set benchmarks for myself after I quit my job. I was like, this is the benchmark that if I hit this benchmark, then I'm going to give it another 6 months. And then if I hit that benchmark, I'm going to give it another 6 months. And at this point, business is growing well enough that I'm not really concerned about that anymore. But that was for the first 6 months or almost a year. That was really how I was thinking about it, is that, you have a certain amount of runway, you have a certain amount of money to work with. And what is the point at which at some point you either need to increase your runway or you need to move on to something else. And so I just tried to think about it in that way, where I was like, one, this is something that's really important to me, so I want to give it a go, but how can I do that in a less risky way? How can I mitigate the downside?
Sure. And I guess to bring Tim Ferriss into this again, as you said, or as he's known to say, what gets measured gets managed. And I think that's very, especially when you're kind of starting off, just like the 6-month milestone, 1-year milestone is probably pretty important. And it's great that you can, continue. It's great that you don't need to necessarily continue to measure it since it's doing so well. So that's really great. When you switched from a job to this entrepreneurial life, there's certain routines, being around people, the water cooler talk, there's isolation that kind of comes along with this entrepreneurial shift, and it can be liberating. It can be freeing. You notice how much more time you have to not, involve yourself in small talk, which is amazing. I think that would be one big perk for me, but at the same time, we're social creatures and we kind of miss that. What have kind of been the biggest hurdles for you going from, let's say an environment where you're working with lots of other people, there's lots of social interaction, and something where you're still interacting with people, you're still interacting with clients, but it's still much more of an isolated environment. What did you find most difficult in that shift?
Yeah, so it's absolutely much more isolated. And I think that, you have to realize that and I don't mean this in a negative way, but your clients aren't your friends, and your clients are it's not the same kind of social interaction, right? It's like you're talking to someone, but you're not like shooting the shit. You're not having a real conversation. You're really focused on work. And they're paying you, and like you can have a casual conversation with a client, but it's just it's different. And so for me, like one, I would say I think probably a lot of us software engineers don't mind the isolation that much.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I work from home. I did work at a co-working space for a little bit, but I actually found that I just prefer to work from home. And the biggest thing for me that I've found is that you have to be conscientious about making and maintaining relationships. So there are the relationships that I already had. There are my friends from grade school and college that, I maintained some of those relationships. And there were 1 or 2 people from work who I was very close with, who I continue to see on a relatively regular basis, but because I'm, making an effort to. And then beyond that, you have to find who your colleagues are. It's just they're just different kind of colleagues. So my colleagues now are people that I've met at conferences or that I've met at like networking events where we realized that we were working on similar things and thought that maybe we could help each other out. And so we've joined mastermind groups, or we'll get on semi-regular calls, or we've discussed working together on different things. And those are the people that I probably spend the most time with now. And I spend all that time is virtual, which is one of the downsides, right? Like most of these people are spread out all over the country. But that's for me anyway, how I have maintained social interaction and developed new relationships and relationships that are driving me, that are helping me move towards where I want to go. Because I think it was Jim Rohn who was the one who said, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Right. And so if I want to be a successful entrepreneur, spending time with my old work colleagues, as fun as that is not the thing that's driving me forward. And it's figuring out, and there are certain people who will, I have one friend from my old job who I do spend a lot of time with still and does help me drive forward in different ways. But you have to realize that it's just going to be different, but that's okay. You need to figure out what it's going to be for you and what that's going to look like and how that's going to work. And I think it's an adjustment. There's a long adjustment period. But once you adjust, I'm pretty happy with the way things are right now. And I have, it's almost fun in a way because I only see the people that I'm closest with on rare occasion. And so we always have a really good time when we actually do get a chance to get together because it's just a different sort of experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think being deliberate about including people in your life and kind of making those connections and taking the time to schedule a phone call or schedule an interview. Well, not an interview, you know what I mean? Like a just kind of touching base with people that you find bring value to your life is really important. It's something that I've tried to adopt in my life recently more deliberately as well, because I found that it really does provide a lot of value. Not to jump too much around, I do want to ask a little bit about sort of what your take on the current setup for technical interviews is. Like, it's probably less than ideal in terms of acting as a general sieve to get good candidates and filter out bad ones. And nothing's perfect. I mean, these big companies that have the luxury of getting a lot of intellectual capital, should we say, they can employ these methods that might not be completely fair to people and could possibly get some false negatives. And maybe just to give a little bit of context to this question, there's a pretty famous tweet, or a pretty well-known tweet by this guy, Max Howell, who was the developer of Homebrew. And he applied to Google, and just to quote his tweet here, he applied to Google, he didn't get in. The tweet goes something like this, I quote, Google, 90% of our engineers use the software you wrote, Homebrew, but you can't invert a binary tree in a whiteboard, so F off, essentially. So that was his heated tweet to Google. Yeah, very classic. It got a lot of publicity, and I think it really kind of gives a good nugget as to why that interview process is not particularly ideal, because you're filtering out people like this, where most of the engineers at Google are using the software that's very pivotal to their development, and yet Google decides not to hire this person because of some contrived problem that you can't solve on a whiteboard. So do you have any take on that? What do you tell your clients? I mean, are you personally frustrated with that process? Like, elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely it's been an area of contention for a long time, right? Like, these are not new interviews, and it's not a new thing for people to complain about. So it's definitely something I've thought about a lot. A couple things to think about when evaluating this is, one, thinking about it from the company's perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Like, a false negative is way better than a false positive, because all of these companies get so many applicants. They get more applicants. Even if they identified all of the good applicants, they get way more good applicants than they could ever possibly hire. So in terms of the false negative thing, I think that's by design, to be totally honest. It's like, I forget what class of algorithms this is, but it's basically algorithms where there's some probability of you getting a false negative, but you never get a false positive, or vice versa. And so like you can design these randomized algorithms so that whenever there is an error, the error is in one direction and not the other.
Right, like a bloom filter or something.
Yeah, something like that. And so that's the, that's sort of honestly, that's their goal here, which is, it is what it is. I mean, it's not great for engineers, but it's good. It makes sense for the company. So that's number one. Number two, I think that, a lot of people like to complain about these interviews, but the other options out there really aren't that great. Like there aren't, if you think about what are the other options here? So you can do some sort of like pair programming thing, which is a super difficult thing to evaluate in any sort of unbiased way, right? Like then it comes down to like, honestly, that's probably more social skills than anything else. It's like, how do you engage with your interviewer and how do you work with that person, which is important, but it doesn't really, your skills your technical skills may be secondary to that. Another option is take-home projects, which, if you ever go on the subreddit CS career questions, you see people complaining about constantly because they take a lot of time. And so it's like, it's not really fair to ask someone to do a 6 or 10 hour project just to get an interview. There are a variety of other similar options, and I just don't think we've come up with any good options. One of the probably best options is doing like paid trial projects with engineers. So like bringing someone on for a couple days, or like paying them to do some sort of trial project. But then it's like, even then from the company standpoint, like what's really the benefit to them in doing that? Because they can't have you do anything real because that would take too much onboarding. And then how do you even, it takes a lot of work to then evaluate the result. So I think that, my take on this whole thing as a whole is that it may not be ideal, but it is what it is. And so you should focus rather than thinking about why this is imperfect. It's better to focus on how can I do as well as I can with what I have. And I think it's sort of a stoic philosophy, like approach to this, which is you control the things that you can control. And if you worry about the things you can't control, that's what makes people unhappy. That's what causes all of the pain and suffering in the world, because people are trying to control things that they can't control. And if you focus on the things that you can control, you will be much happier for it.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Stoic philosophy, and not to make this all about Tim Ferriss. I feel like it keeps coming back here. But I'm gonna
Tim Ferriss all day. I think that's part of the problem.
Well, this is actually a great segue. I know we're kind of approaching sort of like the end, and generally the way I like to kind of lead these things out is very much inspired by Tim Ferriss, and I kind of want to just ask some of the classic Tim Ferriss questions. I just have 3 of them here, and you can be as elaborate or as terse as you want with these. I'm just going to start it off with number 1 and then go from there. So when you feel overwhelmed or unfocused or have lost your focus temporarily, what do you do?
So I'm actually dealing with this right now, which makes this an interesting question. I don't have right now my plan is I'm going to take a completely disconnected vacation next week.
Okay.
But generally something that I would recommend to anyone and that I think is valuable is to like change your environment and change the way that you're doing things. So like if you're feeling like crappy or you're not getting stuff done or you're procrastinating, like go somewhere else. Switch up the time that you're trying to do the work. If you have a routine, change the routine. And changing the routine, I find it's not necessarily a long-term solution, but it can really help me get over that sort of hump. Like if I've been trying to work in the afternoon, change and start working first thing in the morning. And just switching things up, I think can, for me is one of the most useful things.
Yeah, I'll agree with you there. I've definitely coffee shop hopped anytime I feel kind of counterproductive and just trying to go and change my environment. And that usually does the trick for that day. So I agree with that one. So I'll go on to question 2. So what advice would you give to a smart driven college student about to enter the real world? And for, like, I guess for the sake of example here, let's say the real world is like some software engineering company. What advice should they ignore? What advice would you give them?
Yeah. So one, don't worry about what your peers are doing. So, I certainly, as a, if you're going to any, especially top tier school like Princeton, for example, there are going to be a ton of people. I probably had 30 people in my graduating class got jobs at Google. I did not. I got an offer from Amazon, and I got an offer from a company called Yext, which I ended up going with this company Yext, and it was one of the greatest decisions I ever made because it was a much smaller company, and I think I learned much more there than I would have learned anywhere else. But it's very easy to, this comes back to the 5 whys. It's very easy to get drawn in by what other people are saying and what other people are doing and not what's actually going to be best for you. So that would be number 1. And then number 2 would be, I don't think you need to do lots of internships, but make sure you do at least one because it'll make life a lot easier, and focus really hard in your internship on going above and beyond. Because one of the best things you can do for succeeding in job interviews is to already have a job offer. And I know that sounds kind of crappy, but it's true because I was literally talking to a woman today who just got an offer from Google. And she was saying that a big part of why she got the offer from Google was she wasn't stressed out about it because she had no expectation that she would get an offer. She was assuming that she was going to fail the interview, and so she just went in and had fun. And the same can be roughly true if you already have a job offer. There's not the same pressure. And so if you don't have that pressure, you will perform way, way better than you would if you did have the pressure. So focus on getting an internship after junior year, doing really well in that internship and getting that return job offer. And that will honestly make you get better job offers when you are actually interviewing for other jobs.
Definitely. And I've noticed this in my own personal experience, whether it's jobs or even other domains. If you've got some other things lined up, something about not caring about the outcome just makes you that much better. It gets rid of the nervousness. It probably does other things as well, but it really is very effective. So I totally agree with that. Last question here on Tim Ferriss. What is the book or books you've given most as a gift and why? Or what are the 1 to 3 books that have greatly influenced your life?
So I don't really give gifts as books or books as gifts because the people around me mostly either already have the books or they couldn't care less about the things that I'm excited about.
I feel you, man.
A couple of books that I'm just looking over at my bookshelf right now that have made an impact on me in very major ways. I mean, I have to say The 4-Hour Workweek.
For sure. Yeah.
Which is Tim Ferriss's first book. Another book that I read recently that I just thought was fascinating was a book by a guy named Ryan Holiday called Trust Me, I'm Lying. And it's
it's a great book.
How, people can, it's honestly, and I don't want to talk about politics at all, but it was published, I think, in 2012 or so. And it's very informative about about this idea of fake news, essentially, and how there is, whether or not you believe that the news out there right now is fake, there is a lot of fake news. And he talks about sort of how, as the marketing director for American Apparel, for example, they created fake news basically to promote stuff that they did. And I thought it was a fascinating book.
Yeah, that book is awesome. He worked for Tucker Max, I believe, and did like this slander campaign. I got the same sentiment reading that book and thinking, wow, this is exactly what happened in the election. And I noticed, this was published quite a bit before. Not to spend too much time, but I know that you're into Stoic philosophy. if you like Ryan Holiday, he also has two other books which I've really liked, which Ego is the Enemy and The Obstacle is the Way. And he also actually has another book on Stoicism, which I think is called 365 Days a Stoic. And that is every day of the year is a nice little Stoic quote, and then he kind of gives some context to it. So all three of those books I've really enjoyed. Ryan Holiday is a very interesting guy, so good pick there. And then the third book, if you have a third book. Or you could also respond to that as well if you want to.
Well, I will say I agree with I've not read Ego is the Enemy, but I've read The Obstacle is the Way and the 365 Days of Stoicism, which I like because it's really like bite-sized. So if you don't want to read like long letters or anything, it really breaks it down. But let me pick one more book.
If you could.
I'm trying to pick one that's not a business book, because I think that a lot of the books that I read and recommend are business books. One that I really liked, which is a fiction book, which I would recommend to people, is called House of Leaves.
Okay.
I don't actually think you can get an audio or Kindle version of this book, but even if you could, don't. You really need, it's a really fascinating book because it's sort of an immersive thing where it's also a really thick book, and he uses the typography in really interesting ways to help convey aspects of the story. And so it's kind of a horror story. It's a story about a house that is larger on the inside than it is on the outside. And that's all I'll say about it, but it's a really interesting book. And if you like fiction, if you don't like fiction, then that's a separate issue. You need to read more fiction anyway. If you do like fiction, it's a great book to check out.
I love fiction, and I feel like I read very little of it. And I've heard of House of Leaves. I've not read it. I will take you up on that. I'm going to add that to my my Goodreads profile. So I'm going to add that today. Perfect. So that's pretty much it for the Tim Ferriss questions. I guess what can we expect from you going forward, from you and from Byte-by-Byte?
Great question. The big things that I'm working on are filling in all the gaps. So what you're going to see a lot more of, hopefully, is right now I have a bunch of material on dynamic programming, and I have a bunch of relatively broad material on mindset for interviewing and some specific stuff about, like, what are the things that can help you get unstuck and a variety of other more specific stuff. But what I think is missing out there at large, and is missing in Byte-by-Byte specifically, is getting really deep into the mindset around specific topics. So like when I teach a topic, I'm just wrapping up, as I mentioned, teaching this course on recursion. What I like to do is think about how can we totally reframe this in a way that is going to help people to really understand the material in a new light and also be able to apply it more effectively in their interview. So to give you two examples, one is my dynamic programming book / course. I introduce a method called the FAST method. And this is, you find the first solution, you analyze the solution, you identify the subproblems, and then you turn around the solution. And by just having this sort of acronym and this step-by-step approach, it makes it so much easier to use dynamic programming as opposed to just having it as this amorphous thing. And the same is true with my with the recursion course. I basically broke everything down into, there are 6 patterns of recursive problems. And we all know that at its core, recursion is just breaking things into subproblems or writing a function that calls itself. But does that really tell you how to do recursion? No, it doesn't. It's sort of like me saying, oh, well, just drive to the place and then you'll be there.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like, it really gives you no information. And so by breaking it down into these 6 categories of problem, you sort of have a core pattern and then you have variants on the pattern. And this is something that a lot of the students found super helpful. And so what I'm looking to do is to continue this for all of the other topics that you need to know, so that when you're going into a specific topic, you have a very clear framework in your mind of how to approach these problems, how to do it effectively, and how to do it in a repeatable way, so that even if you haven't seen the problem before, you know how to find the solution.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's really a huge missing piece from both of these topics, dynamic programming and recursion. And I think you do a really excellent job kind of filling in those gaps. So I do think that your treatment of those subjects is very unique and also incredibly good. If you could also elaborate more on where people can find more about you, or if you want to kind of, plug any courses that you're currently working on or books that you're writing or anything else, please, like, by all means. I know my audience would most likely find a lot of value there. So if there's anything that you want to mention, please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is byte-by-byte.com, and that's byte-by-byte.com.
Perfect.
And you can download if you want to get my ebook on dynamic programming, that's free at dynamicprogrammingbook.com. And if you're interested in the courses, I would recommend that you go ahead and just sign up you either download the book or go to byte-by-byte.com and sign up for my email list, because I'll launch those every so often. And, I'm relaunching my recursion course coming up hopefully middle of October. So, if you get on the email list, you'll see all that and you can, stay up to date with everything.
Outstanding. So I just want to say, now that we're coming up, I want to be mindful of your time. I just want to say thanks again for taking the time to appear. It's really been a pleasure to chat with you. The time really kind of went by very quickly. I think we covered a lot of ground, but I think there's also a lot of stuff that I would love to pick your brain on, specifically books. I'll make sure that all of the links that you mentioned in this chat are going to be in the show notes or the description below, so people can find those with relevant timestamps so they can jump to specific topics. And with that, I think that's where we'll end the show. So I just want to say thank you again for taking the time today to chat with me. It's really been a pleasure. And yeah,
thanks so much for having me. This has been a great time. And I totally agree. The time got away from us, didn't it?
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure, Sam. And I wish you all the best in your endeavors with Byte by Byte. And we'll call it there.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.